Welcome, folks. We're going to get started here right away on the Introduction to Permaculture, Part 3. If you're just getting in to the room, introduce yourself, let us know where you're coming from, and what you hope to get out of tonight's session. We're going to get started here right away. Again, tonight we're doing Introduction to Permaculture, Part 3. We're going to be going into another principle this evening, and pretty excited to have you guys online right now. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And if someone could just do a sound check for me and make sure that the sound is coming in clear. Yeah, Kirk, I'll be talking about the sweater here in a few minutes. Hi, Genevieve. Nice to have you. Nice to see you, Janice and Gerald. Hey, Amanda, how's it going? Nice to have you, David. Folks, while we're waiting to get started, it would be great if you could take the URL at the top of the live stream and just share it on your social media platform. It helps the video to track, and YouTube keeps an eye on who's sharing and stuff, and that helps our channel overall. Really appreciate it. And we're going to get started here pretty quick here, guys. Kona, nice to have you. Hey, Treen. Vita, I think I said your name right now. Welcome to the show. Everdone Homestead, Sarah for Pennsylvania. Sarah, thanks for putting in your homework this week. We'll be talking about it here shortly. All right, make sure you introduce yourself if you're just getting in. We're going to get started here in 1 minute. And for tonight, make sure you're saving your questions up so that we can answer them a little bit later. By the way, there's a bit of a party going on upstairs, so you might hear a few crashes and bangs on top of me. I apologize for the extra noise. Just the way she goes. And I might get the odd kid coming in, so you might get a shot of my child as well. No problem, Vita. I know how calving goes. Clayton Harper, hey from Calgary. Nice to have you, Clayton. All right, guys, let's get started. So tonight we're going to be talking about Introduction to Permaculture, Part 3. Just adjust my camera here. Again, I won't be monitoring the chat too much. I find it quite distracting. I will check in with you guys, though, after the full hour is up. All right. Sorry, guys. Let me make one more adjustment here, and then we'll get started. Oops. All right, there we go. Lots of windows to manage when you're doing all this stuff. It's kind of a little bit crazy, to be honest with you. Trying to keep them all straight. All right, here we go, Part 3. And yeah, I got a couple of comments there already about my sweater. There's only so many things I can do to impress you guys because most of my body is missing. And so tonight's show is dedicated to collars, blue collars, white collars, and large collars as well. I won't keep the collar up all night, but I was just feeling like I needed something a little snazzy for tonight's show. So that's why I got the big collars on tonight. All right, let's get into it, collars and all. So again, if you guys are just coming in, make sure you introduce yourself. If you can, it really helps if you can share this on social media. I'd really appreciate it. I owe you one. Just helps the channel track a little bit, and we'll get going here. All right, nice to have you, Mark. So Who is Verge Permaculture? I know most of you heard me say this, so I'll go through it pretty quick. But basically, Verge Permaculture is Michelle and myself, my 2 kids. We live in Calgary. We've got a small urban homestead. We left the oil and gas industry about 10 years ago to pursue the instruction and design of permaculture systems globally, but mostly we've worked in Western Canada and Canada over the last 10 years. It's been an amazing ride. I would not change anything at all in the last 10 years that we've done. We've met the most amazing people, and permaculture was what I was looking for when I went to engineering, but I couldn't find it. And so it was something that I've kind of stumbled into by accident after watching a 3-minute video on YouTube when I was getting ready to cut down a couple of kilometers of trees to put in a gas pipeline. So a little bit ironic there. We quit our jobs, traveled the world, learned everything we could about renewable energy, farming, ecology, low energy buildings, renewable energy systems, you name it, we were out there learning it. And as a result of that, we couldn't go back to our jobs. And so Verge Permaculture was born, and then 2 kids shortly thereafter, and we've never looked back. So that's Verge. And right now we are teaching an introduction to permaculture. So if you're just coming in, this is the first episode that you guys have decided to watch. Welcome. There's part 1 and 2 up on YouTube. Tonight's part 3. And this is probably one of the best books on permaculture, I think, in terms of its brevity and how well it's written. I do really like the design manual, which is what I teach out of for our design courses. But when I'm trying to slowly ease somebody into permaculture, this is the book that I usually recommend. So why live on YouTube? I found that there was just not a lot of easy places for people to get information on permaculture that was free and informative. There's a lot of how-to videos out there, but not a lot of videos talking about philosophy and basic design principles. And so I wanted to create that. I wanted to create what I would have wanted and what I needed when I first found out about permaculture almost 10 years ago, as a way for people to try it before they jump in with 2 feet. So this is an aerial view of our urban homestead, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the introduction to permaculture as we get further into the course. And you can see by this picture that we've got an awful lot going on. And there's always opportunity for more stuff to happen on any property. As you'll see, the yield of any property is actually unlimited. And Karen, I did get your homework, by the way. So review, last time we talked about integration and design. We talked about how each element performs many functions. We talked about every element is supported by many others. We did a needs and yields exercise. I got 2 homework. 2 people did homework and sent it back to me. So we're going to be talking about that tonight. Thank you very much for taking the time. Hopefully you had some insights in doing so. We did a needs and yields case study where we talked about chickens and compost piles. And we were going to talk about water as the master element in design, but we ran out of time. So I'm going to make sure that we cover that tonight. So overview, we're going to talk about water first before principle, the next principle. Then we're going to talk about producing no waste and why it's a really profound principle to think about in everything that you do. We're going to talk about my favorite books on rainwater harvesting. And I'm going to be quoting a few things out of those books. And so if you're looking for a book on rainwater harvesting, you'll definitely find these useful. So I'll talk a little bit about them. We're going to talk about how to do a site water analysis. And I'm not sure why there's a question mark there, but maybe it's a question for you. I don't know. And then principle, we're going to talk about capturing and storing energy. And if you're just getting in, you'll notice that I've got really large collars. They're actually rainwater harvesting surfaces. They help to funnel water into my body, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, tonight's show is dedicated to collars. I didn't have a toque for an antelope toque. I was looking for it, but didn't happen. So tonight we went with the crazy sweater. All right, so Karen Seville submitted some homework. And this is a really neat way of doing a needs and yields analysis that I had never considered before. So basically, she had the compost heap on the inside and the annual garden on the outside. And then she showed the relationship between the 2 of them in a really unique way. And you can see that the needs are on one side and the yields are on the other side. And she alternated the needs and yields. So just to look at this annual garden. We've got needs on this side right here, and then underneath it, the yields of the compost. And so it was very easy for her to make relationships between the two elements. And then same on the other side, the yields of the annual garden and then the needs. And so she definitely found a lot of connections between the two. The only feedback I have for you, Karen, is it'd be awesome to see how these two relate to each other in a physical space. Even though we know nothing about the landscape right now, it'd be wonderful to see how you integrated the two together, and if there are any opportunities to add more elements into this. But thank you very much for taking the time to do this. This is great. All right, and so then Sarah from Pennsylvania, she wrote me this nice email. I did the project you gave us in the last permaculture lesson you taught on YouTube. I thought I'd share, even though I know it's very simple, but I learned a bunch from it, and it changed the way I think about my garden and compost pile, which are currently about 300 feet away from each other. So obviously there are some insights there. Thank you so much for teaching this class. I first heard about permaculture from Joel Salatin back when I was still in high school. Unfortunately, I quickly became overwhelmed with all the information in Bill Mollison's book and didn't know where to start. That typically happens. And in fact, I did a YouTube video on how to categorize and store all of the information that you get in permaculture. It's on my YouTube channel. I think it's called Building a Solutions Matrix with Evernote or something like that. If somebody can search that up for me on my YouTube channel and then post it in the chat, that'd be much appreciated. But I had the exact same problem. And so I created a system to store all this information that was searchable, that would allow me to go back to it in the future as I came up with problems that I had to solve. And that's why I call it the solutions matrix. So within the solutions matrix, I've got different topics in every category, which help to categorize my thoughts and the information that I come across. Your class has made permaculture so easy to understand, and it makes sense. I'm so excited about how I can use this information on my farm. Great. Sarah, I'd love to get updates from you and how you use this on your farm and kind of what the insights that you've had. And that goes for all of you guys too. If you feel like reaching out and sharing some of your insights, I'd love to hear them. And in fact, if you've had some insights thus far, please feel free to put them up in the chat window, share them with your fellow students. I'd love to just get some rolling comments going on there in terms of what insights you've had thus far, if you've participated in the introduction to permaculture up until now. And if the activity is really good, I'll flip my collar up again at you guys. All right, so the next one by Sarah was an annual garden and compost bin as well. And so as you can see, Sarah did a really great needs and yields analysis as well. And she actually took some time to build a concept plan showing how the compost played a role in the overall garden. And so this is a really great start. Hopefully you're having some insights as to how these can be placed. Now, hopefully you guys should be having some thoughts around what's missing. There's a lot of information that we still haven't talked about up until now. You know, we're going to be getting into more detail around site-specific planning as well. So this is just the first layer. As we go forward, we're going to add additional layers of information. And as we add additional layers, design gets easier and easier and easier. In fact, what ends up happening is as we constrain the project more, or at the design more, there's really only one or two places for a garden. There's one or two places for a food forest. There's one or two places for a compost heap, one or two places for a rain tank. And all of a sudden it just kind of comes together in one design. And so that's why whenever people hire me, I'm very clear about the fact that I'm not a landscape architect. I design with very specific goals in mind. And when I design with permaculture systems, a lot of the design ideas just emerge effortlessly out of the processes that I am employing in the way that I do design. So out of all those needs and yields, what was common to all of the elements that we discussed? What's a common need of almost every element in a permaculture system? So the question was, what's a common need in all of these permaculture elements? for almost every permaculture system. Water, absolutely, great. Okay, so water is central to life, and it should represent the central component of any design. And in fact, water can be thought of as the master element. It's the master element because, and in fact, what I want you to think about right now when it comes to water is this really simple analogy, okay? So if the sun is the gas pedal, okay, so we're all driving a vehicle, the sun is the gas pedal, and the water is the gas, okay? Now, if you live in a dry, arid, hot place like I do, it's hot in the summertime, it's like driving a dragster on alcohol, okay? And so what happens to a dragster when you run out of gas? The engine stalls. And so when the engine stalls, you are no longer in motion anymore. And so that's what happens to our ecosystems if we don't take water seriously as a central element. So if you're driving a vehicle and you've got sun coming onto your property and you've got some water, if you can't enhance the water effect or the water harvesting potential of the property, then the only option left to you is to actually reduce the take your foot off the gas pedal. So taking your foot off the gas pedal in a really arid environment is equivalent to basically shading out the property. Now, in permaculture, what we always try and do is we try and work with what we've got. We have some fancy little tricks that we can do to try and enhance the water cycle through water harvesting earthworks and water harvesting, which we're going to talk about in the next session. There's really only 4 ways that you can manipulate the water cycle, and we're going to talk about that in the next class, but I'll just give you a really brief overview of it. Number 1 is you can reduce the amount of sun coming in, so you can you can reduce evaporation by increasing the amount of shade. Number 2 is you can change the species on the property, so you can use species that are more drought tolerant or can live with less water, and this is usually when we try and deploy native species that are adapted to the bioregion. Number 3 is you can do earthworks or water harvesting earthworks or water harvesting projects, which can be earthworks, but they can also be other things as well. And the last thing that you can do to affect the water cycle is you can actually irrigate. And it's the one that we try and avoid if we can, but sometimes you can't get away from irrigation. So water is central to life on the planet. And so if water is central to life on the planet, let's look at how we currently design cities. Now, it's really interesting. When a city gets designed, the first thing that they do is they go and strip all the topsoil. The second thing that they do is they try and figure out how many houses they can cram into a specific area. And so in order to do that, they have to basically, nice one, Mark. So what they do is they strip all the topsoil. They try and get as many houses into onto the landscape as possible, and to do that, what they basically endeavor to do is they drain the landscape. And so they do this by putting in gutters. They recontour the land. Essentially, the primary objective in any city is to concentrate and dispose of water to maximize real estate. That's the primary objective. And so if the primary objective is to get rid of as much water as possible, and if water is central to life, then what's the primary design constraint that we're using when we design cities? And I'm going to ask you that question, and you can answer it in the chat over there on the right-hand side as I continue to move on here. So what is the primary design objective if we're actually concentrating and disposing of water? Now, I'm really harping on cities here, but you know what? To be totally honest with you, it's amazing how many rural properties I come to that design their properties to dispose of water, okay? Because the real reason that this happens is that we go into a property as humans and we have a predetermined context or goal set that forces the property to bend to our will. So we want to grow some type of thing on a property that's not meant to grow that type of thing. And in order to grow that type of thing, we try and manipulate the ecosystem in order to do that. And usually what ends up happening is we end up paying the price in energy and pollution, because if an ecosystem is evolved to act or grow in a specific way, then the most effortless way for us to exist, to coexist, to thrive with that ecosystem is to find ecological processes that work with that ecosystem instead of against it. I once had a client come to me and say, I found this property that I really want to buy, but it's full of water, and I'd like to hire you to drain it for me. And I said, well, I'm the wrong type of consultant, because aquatic ecosystems are 28 times more productive than terrestrial ones. 28 times. So when you're working with an ecosystem that has lots of water, it just means that you have to figure out how to harness that 28 times of more productivity. You need to be more creative. You need to understand how water and ecosystems function together. And it's actually a really exciting problem to have when you start dealing with water. Hint, hint is that you end up having to work with aquaculture systems. You end up having to work with tree systems. Trees generally don't grow unless you've got at least 15 inches of rain. So if you're working to get rid of water on your landscape, okay, so if water is central to life, then what is the primary objective of a society that concentrates and disposes of water? What is it? I'm waiting for you guys to put it up in the chat window there. And Mark's going to try and twist stuff that we say. This should be really fun. Mark's not joking. All right. Well, he kind of is joking, but he's not. All right. So all elements benefit from against life. Absolutely. So if we're not designing with life in mind, then we're actually designing for death. And so one of the things that we use in permaculture is this idea of patterning. And so when you pattern your design around something, we want to pattern our designs around life, because life is where abundance comes from. We want to partner with biology. When we're concentrating and disposing of water, we're actually patterning our designs around the desert. And here's the crazy part about cities and even rural areas, is that we get rid of the water as fast as we can, and then we pump it back up to ourselves. And the city of Calgary is really interesting because 30% of the water budget in this city goes into pumping water, specifically the energy involved in pumping water and taking sewage away. So that's an enormous footprint. And I want to just harp on this a little bit, because one of the things that, one of the reasons I should say that people get really depressed about the state of the world is that we're surrounded by these massive problems, absolutely enormous problems. And we say, well, what am I going to do? I'm just one tiny little person. I can't do anything in light of climate change. I can't do anything in terms of peak oil. I can't do anything in terms of any of these massive problems. So I'm just going to turn my TV and turn my TV on and then just shut my brain off and not worry about these problems anymore. But here's the reality of the situation. When 30% of the energy that you depend on living in a city comes from rainwater, you have an enormous amount of leverage to make change. Just by setting up some rain tanks in your backyard, collecting some water and irrigating your property with that, you don't even realize the liabilities that you are saving your community. So number one, when you manage your own rainwater on your own property, you've just cut a huge amount of stormwater out of the system. Okay, so every time we add more stormwater, we need bigger pipes. It costs enormous amounts of money. We need more trucks to go in and clean all the debris out. When we have more irrigation needs, we end up having to increase the pipe diameter in order to get water to our houses. It takes more chlorine to make that water, more energy to process that water to send it to you, more energy to pump it to you. If 30% of the energy in cities is going to pumping water and managing sewage, you have so much potential. And last time we talked about this idea of 1 calorie of food takes 10 calories of hydrocarbons to produce. In the planting, packaging, harvesting, food processing, shipping, refrigeration, you picking it up, you cooking it, that's a really negative statistic, right? But we can always turn the problem into a solution. And so every calorie of food that you grow means that there's 10 calories of hydrocarbons that did not have to be expended in order to keep you alive. So we can always turn these negative statements into positive ones. And this is one of the things that we uncovered when we travel around the world, was this mythology that there is no hope, that there is nothing that an individual can do. And in fact, the only solutions that ever do occur is because individuals take individual action, which is why we started off this course with the Prime Directive, which is that the first responsibility or prime directive of permaculture, if you will, is to take responsibility for our own actions and that of our children, and to get our own house and garden in order to shelter and feed us, and stop worrying about all these other issues. All those other issues disappear when we start learning how to take care of ourselves first. And that's the most important thing that we can do. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. So principle number 2 is this idea of producing no waste. So waste is just an unused resource. And if you're in this program right now and you're looking for an opportunity to create a permaculture-based business, this is the first place that I recommend looking. One of my favorite business ideas of all time is permaculture worm composting. And it doesn't have to be permaculture worm composting. It can just be composting in general. So I'll just give you a really quick example. 1 pound of worms will breed into 160 pounds of worms in as little as 6 months. And in Calgary, that pound of worms sells for about $70, which is around $11,000 every 6 months in worms, just worms itself, not to mention worm castings. Now, a cubic meter of worm castings in Calgary sells for 700 yards. So all you have to do to those worms is feed them compost. That can either be kitchen scraps, or it can actually literally be finished compost. You can run finished compost through worms and produce amazing worm compost. And that is an incredible opportunity. You can take basically $20 to $30 a yard or cubic meter compost and turn it into $700 a yard. And then you can multiply it again by actually turning that into compost extracts, which then you can use to spray on people's lawns and get their lawns off the drugs. So there's so many opportunities within waste. You just have to go and find a waste stream and find a way to put it to productive use. All right, so water sources. So what are the water sources? Where is the water going? And how can we put it to productive use? So the last slide, I talked about produce no waste. The reason I'm talking about water right now is that when we look at water in a city, when we look at water on a rural acreage, most of the time, we're looking at water as a problem. Okay, let that sink in a little bit. We view water as a liability, and we have to change our mindset to that of water being a liability to being an incredible opportunity. Okay, water is a problem when we don't want it, and it's always a scarcity when we do, unless you live in a city which gives you the idea that water is just kind of this unlimited resource. If you're paying attention to the news right now, which I hope you're not, but South Africa and Cape Town has like 80 days of water left. And there's at least 11 other cities in the world right now that are not far off of that 80-day mark. So water is going to become the new liability, not having enough of it. And yet all of our design in society has focused on getting rid of it as fast as possible. It's like the ultimate Shakespearean comedy. It's crazy. And so right now, the analogy that I like to give people is we can see this giant tsunami coming to us. It's a tsunami that needs to be surfed. And you guys are all surfers. And you can get on your boards right now and start paddling as hard as you can, because you know water is going to be a really important resource. So first of all, we're going to teach you guys how to capture and store water on your own properties. And then once you learn how to do that, this is going to be one of the most valuable skills that you can learn in the next 100 years, even less than that, 10 years probably. I'm thinking in really large scales right now. In the next decade, but teach it to your kids too. Water is the ultimate resource. It's what's going to allow us to continue to grow plants on this planet, which is the primary difference between Earth and Mars, is that we have photosynthesis here. So we've got to get water harvesting right. So what are the waste sources? Where's the water going? And how can we put it to productive use? Now, before we continue on, I just want to plug my buddy's book, Brad Lancaster. He's got 2 books, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1 just got re-released. It's incredible. I highly recommend it. If you do not own this book, this is the book on rainwater harvesting. Volume 2 is also really good, but I know that he's in the middle of rewriting it. So there's a limited number of these books available. And so you can try and buy it. You may have to wait though if they're all sold out. So just check it out. Even though he's rewriting it, the original Volume 2 is incredible. The reason that I really like Brad's books on water harvesting is that he makes it really approachable. Especially in Volume 2, what he does is he breaks down every single water harvesting element, where it can be used, some of the concerns with using it, some of the cautions that you have to think about, and some of the opportunities as well. And then he goes into a chapter on how to actually build that specific earthwork. So I'm going to use a couple of images from his books, but I highly recommend getting these books yourself if you don't already own them. And if anybody does own them, I would love to hear your comments on Brad's books in the comment section. Okay, so most of our landscapes are designed to concentrate and dispose of water like we talked about. So basically, the water hits the property and it gets sent off as fast as it comes in. And this is the fastest way to desertification. Okay, and we end up having to bring water back onto our landscapes in order to keep things hydrated. And it's this never-ending cycle. And so principle number 3, so we can think about producing no waste, but we can also bring this into the next principle, which is capture and store energy. Okay, and so energy in permaculture is broadly defined as things like electricity, but it's also water flowing through a landscape. It can also be fruit growing on a tree. It can be wildlife coming through the property. So it's broadly defined as resources that we can put to productive use. And so there's lots and lots of resources that we can think about. So we just installed this solar array on a client's property just recently. And this solar array is going to basically allow them to meet all of their power needs over the entire year just with this. So we can think about capturing energy from the electrical perspective, but also with other resources as well. There's a lot of banging going on the YouTube channel. It's because my kids have decided that the upstairs is meant to be used as a gymnasium, as they do. So I apologize if the sound gets a little bit bumpy there. So water abundance is the exact opposite. And so essentially what we do is we map out all of the water resources coming in one area and how it's leaving, and then we come up with strategies to keep that water on the landscape as long as possible. And so in this picture, we've got rain gardens, we've got curb cuts, we've got rain tanks. There's probably a gray water system in there. All the sidewalks and the driveways are designed to concentrate and harvest the water into these rain gardens. And then somebody said it earlier, slow, store, and sink the water and get it into the ground where it can be put to productive use. And so later in the course, I'm going to show you guys some examples of some of these curb cuts that Brad's done and some of the amazing changes that it's had in Tucson, Arizona. But we're also going to talk about a few other water harvesting features in next week's episode. So make sure you show up to that, because water harvesting is probably one of the most exciting parts of permaculture and the thing that I get most excited about. So before we get into water harvesting and how it works, it's important that we have some basic understandings of how water actually functions. And so in the top left corner, we've got an infinity pool. Now, I'm not saying that through permaculture, we're going to go and build a whole bunch of infinity pools. While they are beautiful, that's not the goal. I use an infinity pool as an analogy or as an example of what it is that we're trying to do. And so water itself can both be the most destructive force, but it can also be the most productive force. And so the difference between water when it's destructive versus productive is when water is pacified versus when water is allowed to flow freely. And so when water is allowed to flow freely over the land, we end up with massive erosion and destruction. When we create water harvesting opportunities that pacify, slow the water down, and generally take the energy out of the water, what we end up getting is abundance. And so the other interesting thing about water is that water will always flow perpendicular to flow. So water will always flow perpendicular to contour. And so what that means is that if you look at this contour map, and perhaps I'll just explain this to you because most people don't understand how contour maps function. So the easiest way for me to do that is just to do another screen share, and I'll show you guys how contour maps actually work. So contour maps are pretty neat because what they do is they allow us to look at a three-dimensional landscape, and then they allow us to take that three-dimensional landscape and transpose it onto a two-dimensional surface. And so if you've never seen a contour map before, if you've never understood how they function, I'm going to give you a little brief demonstration here. And then from there, this demonstration, we can actually talk about how these contours give us really important clues with regards to how to pacify that water, infiltrate it into the ground, and then create abundance. As soon as you learn this principle, your whole life's going to change, at least with regards to gardening and growing, because you're going to be able to create more abundance than you ever thought possible. It's all in the water. So if you take your hand is actually a really great, I'll just put it on the ground, or maybe it's easier on this white paper right here. So if you take your hand and you draw a contour map on your hand. Now, a contour map, if you've never heard of this, I'm just going to give you a couple more things to think about. If you're walking on a hill and you're walking up the hill, where are you going to put all of your weight? You're going to put it on the toes of your feet. And if you're walking down a hill, you're going to put it on the heels of your feet. Now, if you're walking on contour, you're going to have even weight on both the front and back of your foot. And so that's how we define a contour line. A contour line is a line of even elevation across a landscape. So if we look at our hand, it's really interesting. Our hand has got all the same curves that you'll find in a landscape, especially a landscape that is humid. And by humid, what I mean is that a landscape is classified as humid when the precipitation is higher than evaporation, which means that the rainfall is higher than the amount of evaporation leaving the rainfall. And it's really interesting because landscapes that are in humid environments actually are always defined by S-shaped curves, whereas landscapes that are in arid environments are always defined by angular curves. So this is why the desert tends to have more angular forms versus humid environments tend to be much more S-shaped. Well, it turns out that we were a product or a byproduct of a humid environment when we were born from our mothers in the amniotic fluid. And so we actually have all the same S-shaped curves on our body that you'll find in any humid environment on Earth, which is kind of interesting. And it makes it really simple to teach contour mapping on our bodies. And so if we look at our hand, we can actually draw a contour map right across our hand. Okay, so hopefully you get a sense of what I'm doing. So these are lines of even elevation, okay? And so when we go and build a contour map, all we're doing is we're taking lines of even elevation on a three-dimensional surface and we're transcribing it onto a two-dimensional surface. So that's all a contour map is. So we can take my hand and we can actually draw. I might have ruined my pen. Let's use a different pen. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers. Okay, and so that's the contour line of my hand. These are my knuckles right here. Okay, so those are the knuckles. All right, and it's a little bit different than that. It's not quite the same. It's a little bit hard to teach it on YouTube. It's the first time I've ever taught contour mapping on YouTube, so you give me a little bit of credit there. But basically, this is the index finger, this is the middle finger, this is the ring finger, and this is the pinky finger. Now, what we said was that water always flows perpendicular to contour. And so what that means is that when water's flowing on this landscape, we can make a few comments about how water flows. And from there, we can have some insights around how ecosystems function, because what happens is when water flows perpendicular to contour, we can see that water concentrates in valleys. Okay, and so just on the same with my hand, this is a primary valley right here. This is another primary valley, another primary valley. This is a primary ridge, secondary ridge, secondary ridge, secondary ridge, secondary ridge. And so if these are the primary valleys right here, if you go hiking, you'll notice that the primary valleys are always the places that have the most wet loving species. Now in Alberta, that means that that's where the trees are growing. It also means that on the ridges, this is where we have all the dry loving species, because ridges dry out faster than valleys. So a lot of our water harvesting techniques are designed to try and capture and store water and move it across the landscape to even that out. Not always, but sometimes. It all depends on what our goals actually are. And so it's really important for us to be able to understand contour maps so that we can make directives around what the best water harvesting approaches are for a specific problem or opportunity. So that's what this drawing is trying to indicate. Right there I am in a swale in Australia, and in places the swale was up to as high as my hips. And so we were storing millions and millions of liters of water in the ground, recharging groundwater aquifers underneath us. Now, it's really important that you know that you don't have to put swales in order to be a good permaculture designer. What you do need to do, though, is you need to properly apply water harvesting strategy, which means that you have a whole basket of water harvesting techniques that you can choose from in order to capture and store that energy and put it to productive use. So I just want to state that, because a lot of people leave these courses and feel like they have to go put a swale in somewhere. Swales are amazing, but they have to be applied properly. So I want to just talk about what can happen when you get the water harvesting piece right. And sometimes the best water harvesting approach is actually a very, very simple water harvesting feature that looks like it won't do anything. And I use this example because it's a wonderful analogy to what you can do in the world as one individual person. So this is something called a one rock dam. And a one rock dam is basically 5 rocks in a row placed in a stream. And then when we're putting these into dead streams or ephemeral streams, which is where you're seeing it right now. Now, this is in Arizona. It seems as though perhaps this would not have any effect whatsoever in as a water harvesting feature. I mean, it's super small. It's not a big swale like we just looked at. But what's really interesting about it is that these are placed in the riffle of what used to be a creek. Now, if you've never heard of a riffle, we'll just quickly go through a little bit of river theory, and then we'll come back to this example because I just think it's so incredible. So let me just share my screen again here. So the goal with these one rock dams is to place them in the right locations. Now, one of my dreams is to take an old property that has been abandoned or has been farmed in incorrect ways, that has a bunch of these ephemeral drainages on it, and then go and take all the rock piles that were basically picked out of fields and go and put those rocks back into the ephemeral drainages and completely repair them. So let's dig into a little bit about what's going on in this picture here. Basically, in a stream, we've got some interesting patterns here that we can observe. One of them is the thalweg. Okay, and the thalweg is kind of the valley that the river flows within. Okay, it's the boundary. And over time, the meander of the river is going to change within the context of the thalweg. Now, within any river, we've got a few common components. Okay, so we've got pools. And pools are generally the deepest water. This is usually the most important thing for fish to thrive in the river. They need that deep, still, not doesn't have to be too still, but deep and cold water is really important for them. Okay, and then within the pool, if we're looking at it like this, and we have the river flowing over top, we have something called I'm forgetting my river theory here right now. We've got the run and we've got the glide. That's what it is. So the run is right here and the glide is right over here. Okay, so the run comes in here and the glide comes out right here. And then in between the two pools, we have something called a riffle. And a riffle is a wonderful word because it kind of sounds like exactly what it is. And a riffle is basically a grade change in the river. And so if you look at what a river is actually doing, it's actually doing switchback down the mountain. And it does that to maximize edge, but it also does it to minimize erosion. And right here, we've got what are called point bars, okay? And this is what the river uses to put the brakes on in flood events. And point bars collect nutrient and they collect sediment. So when we have a dead river, an ephemeral drainage, we place one rock dams in at the riffle, okay? And so if we go back to that image that we were just looking at, then we can have another quick look at what's actually going on there. So if you take a look at this image, what happened was a series of rocks that were of significant size, big enough so that they wouldn't get blown away in the next rain event, were placed in the riffle. So you can see that's where the pool was going to be, or the cut bank, as somebody placed up on the chat window there. And so that would make this the riffle. And so what's going to happen is as the next rain event occurs, it's going to bring some sediment down there. The sediment is then going to create an infiltration pan behind here, which is then going to bring some seeds with it. And with that increased moisture behind this one rock dam, what do we end up with? We end up with grass. Now the grass is basically the hair on the back of the dog. So what's going on here is we're actually building an upward spiral. So something as small as a few rocks actually will generate an upward spiral. As we increase the water infiltration in this area, these trees sprout leaves. And these leaves are going to reduce the evaporation because they cast shade. Shade is more valuable than mulch. Shade reduces evaporation. As they reduce evaporation, the overall humidity in the soil in that general area increases. As that increases, the trees grow and put out more shade, their evaporation goes down, another rainfall event happens, more water gets harvested, and the whole system starts to spiral up. And so a lot of these water harvesting earthworks that we talk about are basically tiny little sutures, okay? It's like what we've done is gone around the earth and we put millions of cuts into her, and all we're gonna do as permaculture designers is go in and create tiny little sutures in the earth that allow her to start to heal a little bit. And as she heals faster because she starts to grow back. And it's a non-linear process. It happens so quickly once you get those initial sutures right. And so in the next presentation, we're going to talk about some of these sutures. There's way too many to talk about in one intro course, but we're going to hit about 5 of them. And these 5 are probably 5 of the more important ones that you can use in an urban context, but you can also use them in a zone 1 or zone 2 of your farm as well. And so hopefully you can get a sense of the fact that small changes can have a massive impact. And in fact, one of the permaculture principles is slow and steady change. My mother-in-law has a saying that you'll always overestimate what you can do in 1 year, but you'll underestimate what you can do in 5. So the principles are: start with a long and careful observation, store water at the highest point, slow store and sink it, design water in a net or web from source to sink, and bring water back to the top with renewable resources if you can. So in summary, we talked about this idea of principle of producing no waste. So waste is just a human construct. It doesn't exist in nature. Number 2, we talked about water as being the master element. Number 3, we talked about my favorite water harvesting books by Brad Lancaster. Highly recommend them. Number 4, we talked about mapping out water from source to sink. And if you're going to do some homework this week, what I'd recommend you do is draw. I'll just bring up my image again here. If you want to get the most out of next week's course, which is all about water harvesting, I would recommend that you actually map out your water source and water sink. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So it's a really simple exercise, but a lot of people don't take the time to do it because they don't realize how much of a resource they're actually not putting to productive use. So all you need to do is draw out your house. Okay, it can be something as simple as this. And I want you to map out where your eaves troughs are, where your downspouts are. Okay, so okay, and you can actually draw your whole property out on paper. Just line drawing is fine, more than sufficient. And if you have a cadastral map or a real property report, that's totally sufficient. That'll give you all the information that you need. And you should map out all of the access. I'm actually drawing out my house right now. Okay, and I want to know how the water is moving on your property. So we obviously have water coming out of this downspout. We have water coming out of this downspout right here. And then from there, we can start to come up with strategies on how we can take that water and put it to productive use. Okay, and then once we know where the water is coming from, we're going to do some other interesting examples where we talk about zones of use, sectors, and then even some elements. So when we start to delineate zones, which is essentially energy efficiency, and sectors, where there's sun, where there's not sun, where there's wind, where there's not wind, where there's a view or something you want to block. And so we can talk about specific elements and what elements fit within these zones and sectors. And we can talk about the types of water requirements that actually are required for those specific elements. All of a sudden, it becomes really clear that the only thing this is meant to be is a food forest. This needs to be a food forest right here. And the most sun is actually in the backyard on my property. And so this had to be a garden. The only place we could put a garden on our property. And this had to be a passive solar greenhouse. This actually has the most sun right here and the most unobstructive sun, specifically in the wintertime. So a passive solar greenhouse. And then right here, we wanted to create a community sector. So we actually built a cob oven, an outdoor kitchen right here. And so we have this massive kind of community magnet right here that brings all sorts of people around whenever we turn that cob oven on. So we're going to go through zones, sectors, and different elements, as well as water harvesting features in the future shows, and talk about how each of these individual design tools actually sort out all of your design problems. One of the reasons that design is so, or can be so overwhelming, is that people don't have a process to approach it from. And when you use these ideas that we've just talked about, it gets a lot simpler to move through those processes. So next, we talked about principle of capturing and storing energy, and we're going to really build that out in the next week when we start talking about specifically how to harvest and utilize rainwater. And then we talked about the basic characteristics of water and contour mapping, and how water, when it's held in a passive state, infiltrates and creates opportunities for life to thrive. And when it's allowed to rage, it basically becomes a very destructive resource. So out of all of that, that kind of encapsulates today's lesson. Next week, we're going to talk, as I've mentioned many times, water harvesting and water harvesting elements. And we're going to talk about integrating water into your garden and overall design. So from there, this is really going to kind of bring out the whole water piece. And then we're going to go in a little bit further and talk about some of these zones and sectors things. So where to get more information, show notes, check out the show notes for presentation specific resources below, and that'll show up in the version of the course tomorrow. But actually, I'm just looking at it right now, and you'll notice that, I'm just going to take a couple of seconds here. A lot of people don't realize this, but we have some free courses. They're not going to be free for much longer. So if you're interested in taking some free static courses on our website, we have how to design resilient homes, acreages, and farms available right now, which is a 1-hour session on The most important things that you need to know about with regards to resilient homes, acreages, and farms, that's in the notes below. We have passive solar greenhouse case studies. This is also not going to be free for much longer, so please spread the word about it. We have 6 incredible 20-minute professionally produced passive solar greenhouse case studies on everything you've ever wanted to know about passive solar greenhouses. We also have the free Verge blog book. So I've been writing blogs for 10 years on permaculture and permaculture related things, and we had our best blogs put into this book. It's free for download right now. It's a magazine style blog book that you can read on your e-reader. I highly recommend it. There's also all of our design certificates there, the Permaculture Pro webinar series, which is kind of more, not quite one-on-one, but almost one-on-one attention for me and a bunch of other professionals around permaculture, natural building, and farming. The Salatin semester, you can also donate to the show down there. You can connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and there's so much more. I mean, just check out our YouTube channel. We've been producing a ton of videos lately. There's tons of free content up on YouTube. So anyways, thanks so much, guys, for showing up tonight. I'm here for questions for another 30 minutes. If you got a ton of value out of tonight, I'd love it if you guys hit the like button down below. It really helps the channel to track. Also, the other thing that helps the channel to track is if you share this video and other videos on social media for me. I really appreciate it. It's an easy way that you can pay for tonight's show without having to pay. I'd love to answer your questions. So please ask any questions that you've got about tonight's information, and I'll do my best to answer the questions for 30 minutes. I think I saw a couple questions at the top, so I'm going to start with answering those first. I think there was a question about lots of good info. Is water harvesting earthworks different than water harvesting? Seek to find, not necessarily. So water harvesting earthworks is still water harvesting, but you can water harvest with a rain tank, or you can water harvest with a swale or a rain garden or a terrace. So water harvesting is a much more broad perspective of water harvesting. Water harvesting earthworks is specifically what we do to shape the landscape in order to get the water to slow, store, and sink, which Noah's Garden said right below. So thanks for putting that in, Noah's Garden. And I think there was another comment there about, what was a storage program called, Evergreen or something? So it's actually called Evernote. You can use lots of different programs. That's just the one that I chose, and I've got a video on how I use that in my YouTube channel. So yeah, you need to make sure that rainwater harvesting is actually legal in your province or in your state. It's really important, or your however your country delineates areas. Really, really important. It's not legal everywhere, believe it or not. So something to look into and something potentially to lobby your government to allow. Heartway Farms, I have streams and a natural spring on my property, looking for ways to maximize it. So I'll need a little bit more information from you in order to do that. But if you, generally speaking, what we recommend when we're dealing with especially streams or rivers is we don't touch them. They're fine on their own. At the very most, what you can do with them is you can plant more trees around them to reduce evaporation and try and create a riparian buffer, which basically means a buffer between your farm and your stream so that your livestock can't go in there and drink out of it, which a lot of farmers sometimes don't like because it means you have to pump water from the stream to where the livestock are. But livestock can do a lot of damage to streams. And so it's best if we fence them out 50 to 100 meters back and then plant those areas, those buffers, with locally adapted shrubs and trees that will help to reduce that evaporation, cool the water down, and improve the overall water quality in the stream itself. Sandyman, a man lived in central Java, Indonesia, planted banana trees to save his village from flooding and drought. He's been planting for 21 years, even though mocked and ridiculed by peers. You know, there's a lot of these stories out there of people that actually take a little bit of time and a lot of time, actually, a lot of their life, and they just dedicate it to planting trees. There's a wonderful show that you can watch, I think, on YouTube called The Man Who Planted Trees. It's one that I'd recommend showing to your kids. It's a tearjerker, and you know, I can't think of a much better way to spend your life than planting trees to something to that end, basically. So amazing, amazing cartoon, actually. Josh Steele, I'm a full, let's see here. I'm a full section in a glacial arid, I think, area. Contour here is overwhelming. Yeah, I need to see your contour map to get a better sense of what you're dealing with there, Josh. But some properties can be very overwhelming. And so sometimes the best approach to water harvesting is just changing the species that you're working with. So changing the grasses or planting some trees, or changing the way that you manage the land too. Sometimes we don't put swales everywhere. It doesn't always make sense. So there's lots of different approaches. Christine, thanks. Thank you, Rob. So informative. Great. I'm glad you liked it. Heartway Farms, like Noah's Garden. Where do you find info to create a contour map? That's a great question, Noah's Gardens. And the answer is, when we do a consultancy for folks, we actually will produce the contour map for them. And that can happen through a number of different ways. So we can use a drone. In Alberta, we actually have access to all of the LiDAR data, which is basically data that's produced by shooting lasers at the ground from airplanes. And so we can take that LiDAR data, we can put it into a GIS, graphical information system, and we can pump out a contour map. And I'm actually going to show you guys some contour maps towards the end of the session. Sometimes, if you're lucky, there'll be surveys of your property, either in your county or your local jurisdiction. In Alberta, we have oil and gas companies that will sometimes give you those contour maps. So you either have to learn how to do it yourself, or you have to find a free resource, or you have to pay a survey company to come out and do it, and that can be quite expensive. There's one other option. You can actually rent equipment to make it quite a bit simpler. So it's an important step though, and it's one of the first things that we do on any property that we go and visit. Heartway Farms, best way to get water to livestock in the case of keeping them away from the stream. I live in Chicago. And we have cold winters. Totally. I mean, it gets cold up here too, and so there's lots of different ways that you can do that. You can put ponds on your property, and then there are cold climate watering solutions that you can get. In Alberta, they actually have water pumps that pump water from deep down in the ground. And if you've got springs, you might be able to do this. And you actually train the cows how to push the water fountain or the water pump with their nose. And so they'll actually hit the water pump with their nose, and water comes and they drink out of a small little trough. And then when they're done drinking, the water drains back. I think it drains back into the ground or the ground around them. I don't know exactly what happens to that water, but I think it's called a nose pump. So there are lots of cold climate solutions to watering livestock in the wintertime. Really important to get them out of the creeks and streams. Freezing livestock water is a bummer, and I'm not looking for a way to overcome this. Electricity is not close. And I am looking for a way to overcome this. Yeah, so check out the livestock nose pumps. You can also get solar powered pumps that will pump water out of a pond. And there's a guy up here in Alberta, his company's called Sundog Solar. And he's invented all sorts of ways to, sorry, my keyboard's doing funny things. He's invented all sorts of neat ways of getting water pumped around your property with solar. The other thing too is to move water around your property with underground lines. And that's a very common thing that gets done out here. Dakota Cohen, who I have on the show from time to time, actually brings his livestock back into a pen at nighttime so that they have access to heated watering troughs. And so they'll go out and forage during the day, and then they'll come back at night. So there's lots of different options. It really depends on your landscape, your context, and the size of the property. Seek to find, how do you slow, spread, and sink water in your Calgary yard? So I use something called the swale trail system, which we're going to talk about in the next session. It's a great urban strategy. It can also be used in zone 1 and 2, which we haven't talked about yet, but the closed zones basically around your rural homestead. And that's one of the primary ways that I infiltrate water into the ground for my garden and food forest. We also have a variety of rain tanks that we use. So we capture some of that water and hold it back. And then we disperse of that water when we need it, when it gets dry outside. So we only have 2 rainwater harvesting mechanisms that we employ in multiple locations on our property, and it works really well. When we go to other people's properties, those strategies change to also any of the above water harvesting strategies that we're going to talk about next week. Okay, so I can take a few more questions if anybody has any about today's session. Again, if you haven't hit the like button, really helps the channel, so I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. And if there are no more questions, that's okay too. We can end early this evening. I'm sure that you guys all have stuff to do. That's totally fine. Great. Well, it looks like we're almost out of questions for this evening. So again, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Hopefully you got a couple of nuggets of information. Really appreciate you guys spending an hour with me on YouTube Live tonight. And we will be on YouTube again Friday at 3:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And we're going to be talking with Javin Bernakovich from All Points Design, where we're going to be talking about making better decisions in holistic context. It's an incredible subject. A lot of us have never been taught how to make good decisions. And Javin specializes in both helping people to build their own holistic context in private, but also in courses that he offers. And one of those courses that he offers that is through our permaculture design course. Jill Madigan, hello from Milwaukee. Just found out about this and have one more growing season in my friend Consuelo's front yard garden, looking into my next home base. Need to watch and replay. May I? Absolutely. These videos all get placed up on YouTube after the fact. Feel free to watch them and share them. Mary Ellen Kirby, thanks for this. Water is our big bugaboo. Awesome, Mary. Well, hopefully you got a few pointers out of tonight. Annalisa Kadam, how to save excess water during the rainy season to hopefully use during the dry season. Well, there's really only a few ways. The best and cheapest way is in the soil. A 1% increase in soil organic carbon will yield 166,000 liter increase in water storage per hectare of land. Let me just say that again. A 1% increase in soil organic carbon in your soil will increase its water holding capacity by 166,000 liters per hectare of land. Now, for the people in the US, a hectare is 2.2 acres. Okay, so that represents an enormous, I think that's something like 40,000 gallons, 20,000 gallons per acre of land for 1% soil increase approximately. So soil is your cheapest way to store water. Next, we want to reduce evaporation. And then if you do need to store it in volume, you can either store it in an above grade tank or below grade tank, or you can put it in a surface storage like a pond. So we did talk about rainwater harvesting. There's a YouTube video up on our channel. I think it's like 20 tips for rainwater harvesting or something like that. You can take a look at that. We also have other rainwater harvesting videos and blogs on our website. Seek to find, yield and needs opens new ways of thinking for me. Thanks. Yeah, no, you're welcome. I'm glad that that created some insights. 1% carbon, how much water in an average Calgary yard? Well, that's a tough question to answer, but basically in Calgary, we get about 320 millimeters of rainwater per year. And so depending on the size of your yard will depend on how much water, but just to give you an idea of how much falls on my property, I'll just calculate it here. So we get about 160,000 liters on my little tiny property here in Calgary per year. So that's pretty substantial. That's as much water as I need for most gardening years on my tiny little property. Mark Dahl, when's Javin's course again? So Javin will be teaching on YouTube Live at 3:30 Mountain Standard Time. So that's 2:30 your time, Mark, on Friday afternoon, this Friday. And we're going to be talking about holistic context. So if you're interested in making better decisions and holistic context, 3:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on the Verge Permaculture YouTube channel. Okay, folks, well, I think we'll call it a night. Thanks so much for showing up. I really appreciated all the comments and all of the support. And make sure you check out the free resources below. And I hope you guys have an amazing evening. So thanks so much.